Light doesn't show itself until it reflects on something. I was up in somebody's house on the east side doing some electrical work, and there was a little knothole up in the attic. Sunlight was shining through that knothole. On purpose, I blew some dust off of something, and all of a sudden you saw the shape of the knothole projected through the attic. If ever I've had an aha moment of being a sculptor, that certainly was one. So I began this pursuit of making objects that looked like they were light beams stolen from air. Well, my first fascination, my first artistic interest at all was theater. My mother sent us, the three younger boys, a family of 6, with our babysitter, to see a touring show of Peter Pan at the Wilbur Theater in Boston. And Mary Martin flew through the window. And I couldn't believe it. I was 7 years old. I couldn't believe it. I was interested in the story, but I was also interested in this visual effect and the height of the scenery. I was out of my mind. That was my first artistic love, was to be a theater designer, and to be a lighting designer in particular. So I got to Connecticut College in New London in 1975, and all of a sudden I was in with these people that were studying philosophy and theater history and lighting design, and it really gave me my first uptick at 18 of what curiosity could bring you. I left Connecticut College with the idea that I wanted to work professionally in theater, and I just started working. So this kind of life as a lighting person evolved. At some point I ended up in New Haven at the Long Wharf Theater. There was a glassblowing class being taught at Southern Connecticut State College, and I started blowing glass. Halfway through my last tour, 75 cities in 10 months, I ended up in a hospital in Virginia suffering from exhaustion. And I decided to quit the theater tour. I was really spent. And I just began a sojourn around the United States. I had $5,000, this is 1979, 1980. Back then that could afford a lot of cheap living. And I had a book called The Hot Glass Information Exchange. At the end of the book was the 20 artists that had participated. And I started driving around the country calling these artists. I'd get to their city, picked up the phone, and more often than not, people would say, hey, I need some help for a week. And the glass scene was beginning to grow. And then I said, I'm gonna go back to college. So I went and studied at UMass Amherst and met my wife, fell in love. But on a whim, I applied to RISD. So that's how I got to Rhode Island. RISD was a great thing for me, and I really kind of gave myself in to all these other things that were being taught. And so in my late 20s, I was really getting a complete shift around. But there was nothing I could do that interested me. All my glassblowing, I loved the action of it, but there was no object making that interested me through the glassblowing process. Certainly by the time I left art school, my main focus for my object making was cast glass. And to this day, I mean, I work with other materials, but that is certainly the main focus of my studio practice. In the technique that I use, which is a process called pâte de verre, French for paste of glass, a more modern denotation of that would be fuse casting, because we're actually taking what looks like snow cone ice of glass, putting it into plaster molds that are used once. The plaster mold is brought up slowly in an electric kiln. That glass melts down into that mold, and then the oven is cooled, the plaster mold is broken, and you're left with that object. One might say, oh, you know, you make a casting and that's the object, but in my crazy world, we make 700 parts to make the one object. After we get everything cast, it's all got to get cut, and every one is it becomes a unique part. It's ground to fit only there, and adhered together with these epoxies. So for every piece, we make a different cutting fixture. One of the reasons I stayed in Rhode Island is there still is the infrastructure to get practically anything made here. So I've got a machine shop around the corner that does all my fixture making for me. And by tooling, I just mean any clamp or jig or something to hold something in place. I'm done making a piece, and most of the fixtures get thrown away. I think it's pretty important to me that things are pitched. I'll make a little model, and that'll just sit around, and then eventually I'll go to an old-fashioned drawing board, a drafting board, and I'll make some very simple elevations and some cross sections, maybe a little isometric view of it, but it'll be just some lines on the paper. And then eventually, when I'm beginning to really fully form it, I'll then start going over to the computer and really begin to flesh it out. So in a very simple way, I'm able to bring many variations of that thing. By the end of a day, I can be done with what would take me 2 weeks on the drawing board. I built a piece at the Fuller Museum in Brockton, Mass. Called Line Form Shadow, where I wanted to take the scale of 8 feet and scale it up to 18, 20 feet and not worry about the glass. So I built the piece out of tension steel wire formed with Architect's yellow trace paper over it. And we cut probably 1,000, 1,500 panels. This was the beginning of this building process that I use with the glass now, but we built this big framework of 2 objects in this gallery. I really felt like I was onto something. And this has been the pursuit for the last 8 years. I get up in the morning and I have a cup of coffee and I read the paper, and I come to the studio like somebody comes into the office or the factory, and I love it. We have an incredible infrastructure here in the studio. I don't job anything out. All the glass casting is done here. And we're a mixture of very old world techniques and the most modern computer processes available today. What I like most about what I do is posing problems to myself. And these problems happen to be objects. And then I figure out how to solve these problems of the making, and it really engages me. I'm really fortunate to have great assistants that I've had for some years. And so we have a way of working together where we can really solve these problems. The process to me is as important as the object. I mean, everything is labored over. The objects tend not to look slick when they're done, but they have that hand-hewn look. And it's worth noting, another reason I got onto this modular building technique is I'm intending to make objects higher than 10 feet, higher than 20 feet out of glass. Here, as cumbersome as these techniques that I'm developing are, there's really no limit to what I can build given these techniques. It's a study in engineering, because I love that. I'm enamored with all the construction processes that I'm inventing to make the work. But it's also part about enclosing space where all of a sudden I've defined what you're looking at, not only by my object, but by its relation to the space that it's in. In the studio, I intend to keep making these objects out of elements. And I want to continue this study of how do you make an object that refers to these glass objects that I make, but you take away the engineering difficulty of glass and bring up something that looks skin-like that tall. I'd love to divide a space 60 feet tall with armatures and gossamer elements. So that's what's next, I hope.